Hey Optimancers, Chris here. Wizards have long been lauded as the most powerful class in D&D by, I'd say, the majority of optimizers, but now we've seen Xanathar's Guide to Everything and Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, and the question is, has anything changed? In my last video I compared the bare bones classes of Wizard and Sorcerer. If you missed that, I'll post a link above and in the video description. But the short of it is that looking at those base class features and options, the Sorcerer shows some strength in starting saving throw proficiencies, and especially with the potency of Metamagic powered through sorcery points. But the Wizard can match that with the strength of spell preparation, ritual casting, and more castings per day. Where the Wizard pulls ahead is with the vastly stronger Wizard spell list, giving options for Wizards that leave the Sorcerer looking with envy. But if we're really going to answer the question, which is the more potent class, we can't just look at bare-bone classes. We need to look at the whole picture. Subclasses are not of equal strength. How does multiclassing change the picture? So by the end of this video, I will definitively declare once and for all who is the more potent class in D&D. You know, in my opinion, and maybe not so definitive, but, I'll declare a winner. I will declare a winner. If you would like to support what I do on this channel, please check the link in the video description for my Patreon. Patrons of this channel see these videos early and non-monetized, and my top-level patrons join me to play some D&D each month, DM'd by me. Today, I would like to recognize these top-level patrons: Math Guy Dave, Matt, Mikhail Precursor, Nathaniel McCauley, Nick Lutz, Nick Simmons, Pedro DeVaca, Philip Martin, Philip Glavorgian, and Robbies. Thank you all so much for your support. Let's get started. So, I had to think, first of all, if I was going to restrict this to the main source books of the Player's Handbook, Xanathar's and Tasha's, or if I was going to include things like campaign setting source books. And I decided that, if we bring in the chronologist, it's really not a fair fight. And in reality, we're not going to see Wildmount material allowed at quite a few tables, so it really ends up being not an accurate comparison either. So I'm just going to be using the main source books for this comparison. Now, if you're disappointed by that because you use these materials, then just for you, I'll do it. But really quickly, chronologist wins. Okay? Now that we got that out of the way, let's continue our voyage down the rabbit hole. So let's talk about subclasses. Let's talk about multiclassing. Can the Sorcerer catch up when these things are taken into account? The base structure of a subclass for any class is consistent. In the case of Wizards, a subclass will provide 2 features at level 2, one at 6th, 10th, and finally one at 14th. Sorcerers are a bit different. A Sorcerer subclass will, at least now, provide you 2 features right at level 1, one at 6th, 14th, and 18th. It should be noted, however, that in the Player's Handbook, a Sorcerer subclass would only be provided a single feature at level 1. And those features were not so great as they had the value of 2 features. They just apparently decided after the Player's Handbook to give Sorcerer subclasses a boost. And speaking of which, although Player's Handbook Wizards technically got 2 features off the bat in the Player's Handbook, it was 1 good feature and 1 feature that provided a nominal bonus describing certain spells, which was honestly forgettable, didn't have much impact on gameplay, and in a lot of cases no impact at all. But like with Sorcerers, since the Player's Handbook, they've switched to 2 potent features to start out the subclass. So we should see something relevant here. Sorcerers may access their subclass slightly earlier, then both classes get another feature at level 6, but look what happens after that. A Wizard will receive all their subclass features by the time the Sorcerer gets their next feature. Then the Sorcerer is waiting till level 18 to get their final feature. So if we consider that D&D adventure paths tend to end anywhere from, usually around 10 to 15th level, this is a win for Wizards, since they're going to access more subclass features. And even if you're playing in a campaign that was to go right to level 20, assuming we're not starting at level 18, and I have never heard of an extended adventure pass starting anywhere near that level, our wizard can still expect to have more subclass features through all of the gameplay from level 10 to level 17. Now, I would have thought in theory that the power level of a feature would be tied to the level in which it's received. But other than possibly the Fey Wanderer Ranger subclass, we really just don't see that. Often, in fact, the best feature in a subclass is the first feature we get. We certainly see that with the Diviner, and arguably a number of other Sorcerer and Wizard subclasses as well. So it's not like an 18th level feature for a Sorcerer is more potent than a 14th level feature for a Wizard subclass. And this extra weight, you might wonder, why does it even happen? And I suspect this is to make, and this is going to sound trivial, but to make the class chart look more smooth. But there is a good design reason to do it this way. The designers want every level you achieve in your class to feel like more than just a few more hit points. And a Sorcerer already got an additional Metamagic selection at level 10, so rather than give you a subclass feature on top of that, they push them back to levels 14 and 18, which were otherwise pretty dead levels. I mean, it's no coincidence that none of these features for either subclass show up on a level where you also get access to higher level spells. But when it comes to who ends up ahead in terms of power, this one has to go to the Wizard, widening the gap between Wizards and Sorcerers. But we should also look at the overall benefit of these subclasses. Which subclasses stand out, and exactly how much do they really boost the effectiveness of our Sorcerer or Wizard? But first, let's do an overview on multiclassing. I think when it comes to multiclassing, there's just no question that the Sorcerer is easier to multiclass with more classes. Charisma is the most common primary ability score in the game, so a Sorcerer multiclasses seamlessly with the Paladin, the Warlock, and the Bard. Wizards multiclass seamlessly with the Artificer, and before Tasha's, they didn't even have that. Now, before we go any further, that does not mean that either Sorcerers or Wizards cannot be combined effectively with other classes in multiclassing, but there is a clear and obvious advantage to multiclassing with a class that has the same primary ability score. So we need to give the Sorcerer a point here. So let's look at how subclasses in multiclassing might change our views on the comparison between Sorcerers and Wizards. First, let's review some of our conclusions from the video I made last, which was just the bare bone classes. Do subclasses in multiclassing change things? Well, when it comes to the saving throw advantage, we determined that the Sorcerer has an advantage here because Constitution saving throws are the most common saving throw in the game, especially when you're playing a spellcaster, so starting with that proficiency is a bonus for Sorcerers. Now, the Wizard can take a dip in Artificer, and that would give the Wizard proficiency in Constitution saving throws, so that's an easy enough way to gain that advantage. But there is a cost. Multiclassing puts our spell progression behind. And let's be honest here, when it comes to Wizards and Sorcerers, spells are it. They are the main reason why we want to play these classes in the first place. And higher level spells, at least for the most part, there are exceptions, but for the most part, they're better than lower level spells. You might not notice the difference at level 6 when you have third level spells either way, but you sure will notice it at level 5. In fact, at pretty much every odd level, you're going to feel the impact of multiclassing on the potency of your spell casting. So just the option of Sorcerers being able to get that proficiency without a multiclass dip, and without the expenditure of a feat, and feats are not free. I should not need to say that, but you would be surprised how often I have conversations with people who seem to act like they're free. Feats, they are expensive. You don't have very many of them. You always want to spend them on multiple things. So if you're spending them on one thing, you're not spending them on another thing, not free. But yes, we can boost our saves through subclasses. but both classes can do that. And we'll go a bit more in detail regarding that later in this comparison, but overall I would say our score hasn't really changed here. Starting with Constitution saving throws, still an advantage for sorcerers. Then we get into prepared spells versus known spells. And as we compare the preparations of wizard against the known spells of a sorcerer, we can see the wizard gains a sizable advantage here, in both the number of spells they could have at the ready to cast with spell slots, but also in their ability to switch those spells. Does this change? Yes, this one changes pretty dramatically. Both the Aberrant Mind and Clockwork Sorcerer drastically increase the number of spells known for the sorcerer, and there are no wizard subclasses that improve the number of wizard preparations. So once those subclasses are taken into account, our comparison changes to this. So what we see is right from first level, the wizard loses their entire advantage here. And by level 3, they're actually behind. And they're not behind by a bit. They're behind by 25% right off the bat. And they stay over 20% behind until level 14. So what levels are those? Those are the levels that see the most play. Things are the most dismal for the wizard at level 9 when the sorcerer has 20 spells ready to cast with slots and the wizard has 13. The wizard used to have 3 additional spells ready to go here. Now the sorcerer has 7 additional spells ready to go. The wizard remains behind right until they finally recover at the very highest levels, and they take the lead at 20th level. But even then, the wizard had been 80% ahead at 20th level before. Now they're just barely squeaking out ahead. And again, just for one level, and the level that sees the least amount of play of all of them. So this is a complete reversal. The wizard had many more spells prepared than a sorcerer had known. But now the Clockwork Soul and Aberrant Mind sorcerers totally flip that on its head, and for several levels actually double the original sorcerer spells known. This is a huge advantage that once belonged to the wizard, but as long as you play one of these two subclasses, now it's a big win for the sorcerer. Now when it comes to switching spells, wizards still probably have an advantage here, but it has been whittled away somewhat because the Clockwork Soul and Aberrant Mind sorcerer double the number of spells they can switch at level ups. I still have to say wizards are ahead here, but that lead is reduced, and reduced enough that I would say that when it comes to the spellcasting mechanics, now the sorcerer has the overall advantage. And we have to take that big advantage for wizards and hand it to the sorcerer. So the wizard loses ground and the sorcerer gains ground. It's quite the turnaround. Way to rally sorcerer. So what about recovering spell slots and ritual magic? Here we said the wizard had a big advantage, and nothing has changed. The sorcerer is still outmatched here. Yes, you can take a feat to get ritual casting, but as I mentioned before, feats are not free, and there's no sorcerer subclass that provides ritual casting as a feature. So although a sorcerer can have more spells to cast with spell slots, wizards still have spells they can cast without using spell slots. So wizards, they keep the point they already had here. There's no change to our score. What about Metamagic? How do wizard subclasses change this metric? Well, as it happens, a lot of wizard subclasses features actually replicate or even improve upon some Metamagic options. For example, the Evoker can protect allies from evocation spells more effectively than a sorcerer can with Careful Spell, since Careful Spell merely gives allies a successful save, and Sculpt Spells also has them take no damage. But this is limited to evocation spells only, but it doesn't use any additional resources like sorcery points either. An enchantment wizard effectively twins any enchantment spell that targets only one creature at level 10. Again, this is limited by spell school and is not in play until level 10, but it doesn't use any additional resources. An Order of Scribes can change the damage type of spells, similarly to Transmute Metamagic, also without expending additional resources. But in the end, sorcerers simply have more options here, as well as options that can't be duplicated. And they get multiple metamagics. So, although wizards do narrow the gap a bit when we look at subclasses, I still think Sorcerer Metamagic is a uniquely powerful feature that provides sorcerers an advantage over wizards. Our score remains the same, sorcerers are still ahead. What about the big one though? We discussed the difference in the size of spell lists, and the difference is dramatic. And those spells the sorcerer doesn't get access to. A lot of them they want. I mean, they really, really want. How does the big picture change when we look at everything? Well, we do have sorcerer subclasses that allow the sorcerer to gain spells that aren't on the sorcerer spell list. In fact, we have 3 such subclasses: the Divine Soul, the Aberrant Mind, and the Clockwork Soul. Wizards just don't have subclasses that do that. So if the wizard wants to get spells like Aid, for example, and they do, there's no easy way to accomplish that. If they want a spell like Arm of Agathis, which they do, they would need to invest in a feat. And say it with me, feats are not free. So, how does this change our comparison of spell lists? Well, the most dramatic example is the Divine Soul Sorcerer, because they gain the entire cleric spell list. Now, there are some spells on both lists, but this is still a lot of spells. How many? Well, I didn't add it up, because honestly, there is no easy way to do that, and if Divine Soul Sorcerers had the spells known of a Clockwork or Aberrant Mind Sorcerer, then it would have been worth the time, but Divine Soul Sorcerer gets 1 additional first spell known. This is not nearly enough to match up with the wizard. Though I will say the improved cantrip list is very improved, but if the sorcerers want to keep the advantage they're building here, then we kind of need to stick to looking at the subclasses we've relied on so far, the Clockwork and the Aberrant Mind. And both these subclasses do have access to additional spells. In addition to the sorcerer spell list, the Aberrant Mind can access spells of the divination and enchantment schools for both wizards and warlocks up to 5th level spells. And some of their base psionic spells aren't sorcerer spells either. So how many additional spells is that? Well, there was no easy way for me to add up that number either. But being that this was very relevant to the comparison, this one I did add it all up. So we go from 135 spell advantage for wizards to 115 spell advantage. So that is lower, but it's not a lot lower. Definitely not enough to change our verdict. There are spells added that are significant. Tasha's Hideous Laughter is a great spell for twinning. Ever's Black Tentacles is a great spell. And the sorcerer actually gets a summoning spell. So these things aren't insignificant. But it's not enough to draw a different verdict. If the Aberrant Mind was getting access to some spells that the wizard couldn't get but would want, I might draw a different verdict. But the big additions here, the wizard can already get those spells. Wizards don't care that they can't get Arms of Hadar. They just don't. So in the end, we still have a sorcerer that accesses significantly less spells than a wizard can, and wants spells the wizard can get, and the reverse simply isn't true. So what about Clockwork Soul? The Clockwork Soul can access the spells of Abjuration and Transmutation schools for both wizards and warlocks up to 5th level spells. And they have some Clockwork spells not normally available to sorcerers as well. So how many additional spells is that? Well, it's 29 spells. So we still have a gap of over 100 spells. It's a lower gap, but it is still a lot of spells. But we do pick up some spells here that as a sorcerer we never had access to that we really wanted, like Wall of Force, that was a big one, Transmute Rock, Summoning Spell, and more. But here's the big thing. We get Arm of Agathis. A wizard wants that spell, but can't get it. We get Aid. A wizard wants that spell, but can't get it. We actually have some spells on our list that a wizard wants, but can't get. So does that mean the sorcerer now takes the marbles for spell selection? No, not remotely. The wizard still has many spells the sorcerer wants and can't get, and just a lot more spells overall. So the wizard still wins here, but the gap is definitely lower. So this was a massive win for wizards before, but with Clockwork Soul in the mix, now it's a win for wizards of decent size. But this does mean, as we look at everything else, if we want to keep these wins for Sorcerer, we can really only look at Clockwork Soul and maybe Aberrant Mind. So let's move on and talk about defense. So who comes out better defensively? As in, who ends up being the less squishy option? Sorcerers or wizards? Well, first I should mention that neither class is actually squishy. I mean, they do have fewer hit points, that is true, but when it comes to our complete defensive package, both classes actually fare pretty well if we take advantage of some pretty easy options. For Sorcerer, a single level dip in Paladin or Hexblade Warlock won't interfere with our Constitution saving throw proficiency as long as we take that dip after our first level as a Sorcerer. In either case, this dip provides proficiency in medium armor and shields, and since our Sorcerer can have the shield spell on top of that, that's a base armor class of 19 that can be achieved without any magical equipment, which can be boosted to a 24 temporarily with a shield spell. Even early in the campaign, an 18 base armor class requires a relatively low investment of 60 gold pieces. So by level 2, we're talking about proficiency in Constitution saving throws, base armor class of 18. That's pretty solid. So in fact, we're probably a lot more durable than those frontline warriors with their two-handed weapons. And multiclassing isn't the only way to do it either. We could also grab a race, like the Hobgoblin, and take the moderately armored feat. Or we could take something like the Githyanki, and then we can wear medium armor right off the bat, though we don't gain proficiency with a shield. But still we can get a reasonably good armor class. I mean, even if we don't do any of those things, just a Sorcerer with mage armor has an okay armor class, and put shield on top of it, not bad at all. What about the Wizard? Well, a Wizard can dip a level of Artificer right at level 1. This actually puts us in an identical position with defense, with Constitution saving throw proficiency and armor class of 18, and this is right at level 1, assuming we invest 10 gold pieces in a shield, and they have the same racial and feat options as the Sorcerer does, as well as the option of just using mage armor and shield, and you'll still have a decent defense. But overall, what we see here is that when it just comes to armor class, these are pretty close, and I think we could call that basically a tie. Now, does the consideration of subclasses break the tie? Well, the Clockwork Soul Sorcerer can raise a hit point absorbing shield with Bastion of Law at level 6. They can raise temporary hit points with Armor of Agathis, and they can raise maximum hit points with Aid. Can you do them all? Yep, all of these stack. Bastion of Law is a shield that absorbs damage, not actual hit points. Armor of Agathis gives temporary hit points, and Aid raises hit point maximum, so it's not temporary hit points. Aid actually raises the maximum hit points of 2 allies as well, and it scales really well. Oh, and it's also one of the better healing spells in the game, since it also raises the current hit points of the creature targeted by the spell. So you could technically bring up 3 unconscious creatures with a single one-action cast. Technically a bonus action if we quicken, though I would say that's worth the action. How about wizards? Well, the Bladesinger can raise their armor class by their intelligence modifier twice per day for a minute as a bonus action right at level 2. But that can't be combined with armor or shield, so it really doesn't boost that armor class from the Artificer dip. But there is the significant advantage to spellcasting if we don't multiclass, so at least we have that option. Straight class Bladesinger should have a higher armor class than a straight class Clockwork Soul Sorcerer most of the time, and by a significant margin too. A War Mage can boost their armor class by 2 against an attack, or boost their saving throw by 4 using a reaction, and this isn't limited in the number of times it can be used. Now, because it uses a reaction, it can't be combined with something like a shield spell or an absorb element spell, but a boost of 4 to any saving throw, even using a reaction, is a huge boost to defense. Consider the Divine Soul Sorcerer. They can boost 1 saving throw per short rest by a similar amount. As for Clockwork Soul, well, they can remove disadvantage on a saving throw, but how often do we make saving throws with disadvantage? Almost never. And I mean, at 14th level, they can boost some saving throws, but that's level 14, and that's a limited resource. The Aberrant Mind gets advantage to Charm and Frighten saving throws at level 6, and although both those saves do come up, they still are by far the minority of saving throws you'll make. So for saving throws, you gotta give it to the War Mage. But what about those hit point boosts? Well, now we have to talk about the School of Abjuration. The Arcane Ward raises a shield that absorbs hit points, not unlike the Clockwork Sorcerer can do, but the Abjurer can do it at level 2, Now it also technically uses a resource since you need to cast an abjuration spell to raise it and replenish it, but thanks to Tasha's, we can actually do this without expending a resource by taking a feat. That feat is Eldritch Adept, and it gives us a single Warlock invocation. The invocation we want, Armor of Shadows, which allows us to cast Mage Armor at will, and it's an abjuration spell. So, with a single feat investment, which, say it with me, feats are not free, between combats we should always be able to replenish our Arcane Ward, which at level 2 is probably providing an additional 7 or 8 hit points of durability, which can also prevent concentration saves, I should mention. So that feat, which is not free, is still providing great value for the investment, and it brings the Abjurer into that durability level that we might have gotten with a Clockwork Soul, because unlike the Clockwork Soul that has their Bastion of Law, which is going to get depleted, and their Aid spell, which is going to get depleted, and their Armor of Agathis, which is going to get depleted, the Abjurer can continually replenish their Arcane Ward. So there's nothing the Clockwork Soul Sorcerer can do to match this kind of extended durability. And if we don't take the feat, well, then we're still talking about 7 or 8 hit points of durability on a second level character. That's more than enough to give the Abjurer more effective hit points than those frontline warriors, with the exception of maybe Raging Barbarians. So I think when it comes to defensive options, both classes actually do quite well. But the Wizard, it's coming out on top here. Both options for saving throw boosting, as well as options for hit point boosting. Sorcerers are still ahead, but we're getting closer. So what if our character wants to swing a weapon? Who's coming out ahead once we take all our options into account? Well, I think if we're looking at the Wizard, the obvious option is the Bladesinger subclass. At level 6, they gain extra attack, but unlike extra attack for everyone else, the Bladesinger can replace one of those attacks with a cantrip. You know, like a Booming Blade or Green Flame Blade, or if they're at range, a ranged cantrip, which by level 5 will often outdamage a single shot from a ranged weapon. At level 14, a Bladesinger can also add their intelligence modifier to melee weapon damage rolls when they're using Bladesong. By this level, we're likely looking at a +4/+5 per hit, which is a pretty big bonus. A Clockwork Soul or Aberrant Mind Sorcerer just can't match that single-classed. Multiclassing, though, is a factor here. A single level dip in Hexblade gives us use of our Charisma modifier for both weapon attack and damage rolls. Bladesinger can't use intelligence without a 3-level multiclass. Hexblade can also allow us to add our proficiency bonus to damage rolls, and that can be up to a +6. Paladin can give us Smite. Bard can give us Weapon Flourish. But in both these cases, we're talking about a significant level investment. And here's the kicker. There's no extra attack, not without 5 levels of multiclassing. No Sorcerer subclass gets extra attack. So what it comes down to is that if we really want our Sorcerer to compete with a Bladesinger for weapon swinging, it means such a multiclass investment that we're no longer really competing in spells. You know, the reason why Wizards and Sorcerers are lauded. Now don't get me wrong, a Hex, Pally Sorcerer can be a very effective character. But if we're doing more than dips here, then we aren't really comparing Wizards and Sorcerers anymore. So Wizards, they have to win this one, at least if they're a Bladesinger. If they're another subclass, then either class can potentially swing a weapon with an attack cantrip while concentrating on inanimate objects or Bigby's Hand or Shadow Blade or whatever spell you're using. So without Bladesinger, this is much closer. So is this a point for Wizards? Yes, it is, but only if we give up points from earlier, because you can't be 2 subclasses. So overall, our score, it's unchanged. But we need to talk about initiative. We need to talk about it because when it comes to spellcasting, winning initiative can be a pretty big deal. Well, if we want to improve our initiative with a Sorcerer, we have the Alert feat, which is not free, and Wizards could take it too, and not much more. I mean, there's super limited stuff, like you could have a Wild Magic Sorcerer using Tides of Chaos, but that's so limited, it's barely worth mentioning, which I just did. Wizards, though, the War Mage pops up again. The War Mage gets their intelligence bonus to initiative rolls. Sorcerers just can't match that. Now, you can play a War Mage Bladesinger, So you have to choose your priorities. But if initiative and saving throws are those priorities, the wizard has a really solid option in the war mage, and sorcerers don't. I think we need to give wizards a point here, and now it's really close. But there's one more thing we need to talk about, because we need to acknowledge that there are some additional features from certain subclasses that are worth mentioning if we're comparing the value of wizard and sorcerer subclasses overall. A diviner's portent is one of the most effective subclass features in the entire game, and it's gained at level 2. An enchanter's hypnotic gaze can really give a low-level wizard options that are effective without expending spell slots. An illusionist's illusory reality potentially breaks the game, though not until level 14. The Order of Scribes' Awakened Spellbook is nearly invulnerable, and it adds flexibility to casting, especially with things like touch spells or spells that originate from the caster, like cone spells, at level 6. Multiple sorcerer subclasses get concentration-free flight at level 14. An Aberrant Mind Sorcerer can cast component-free spells using sorcery points at good value from level 6. But if we narrow our sorcerer subclass options to Clockwork Soul and Aberrant Mind, which I would argue are the most powerful subclasses for sorcerer to date, then we can't just look at what they do to spell mechanics, as we already have, but we must also compare the rest of their features against the best wizard subclasses. And there are a lot of really good wizard subclasses. I've mentioned a few. Bladesinger is a good subclass. Warmage is a good subclass. But in fact, I would say most of the wizard subclasses are actually quite good. And when we do that, we see that the other features for Clockwork Soul and Aberrant Mind, though some are good, they're not quite as good. And neither of them have an amazing feature before level 6 other than their extra spells. So wizards pick up ground when we take that into account. So where does that leave us? Well, I would say this got really, really close. When Tasha's came out, I did a video with an overview where I said that sorcerers did really well here. And a lot of people weren't sure what I even meant by that. Well, this is what I meant. After we take everything into account, I think we have to keep the crown on the wizard's head. But man, this is almost too close to call. I can't confidently say anymore that I think wizards are the most powerful class in the game, because sorcerers are biting at their heels. But we could ask, are either the most powerful? Because Twilight and Peace Clerics now exist. And then we're talking about game-breaking mechanics right at low levels. But personally, I try to forget those subclasses even exist. So at least in my mind, Wizard is still king, but Sorcerer is eyeing the throne. So what do you think? Which is more powerful, Wizards or Sorcerers? Let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon.